Hey project fam, welcome back to another project. Today what we're going to do is we're going to start our container gardening series, and I am going to build these self-wicking containers in the garage. I've been using these containers for years and I love them. Why? Because you don't have to water the plants every day. At the bottom of the container is a reservoir of water. Stay tuned. Now, the hardest part of getting started with any project is getting all of your materials together. And I've had some of this drainage pipe hanging from my garage for years, and little by little I've been taking pieces from it and I've been building containers. I don't even know how many storage containers that I've built that I use for gardening, but they are awesome. So now I'm finally going to, I think, finish this roll. As always, all the materials that I use, there'll be a link in the description. So I used a flexible drain hose and then landscape fabric. So if I measure this landscape fabric, it looks to be about 4.5 inches in diameter. That'll be important later. So landscape fabric is typically used when you want to cover an area and you don't want weeds to grow through. So you would actually cover it with landscape fabric to keep the weeds from growing in the unwanted areas. In my case, I'm actually using it to cover up the drainage pipe that you see there. So if you remember, I measured that pipe to be 4.5 inches in diameter. If you look, I'm drilling a hole at about 3.25 inches or 3.75 inches. It's a 1-inch diameter hole. So what'll happen is air will be at the top of the pipe, water will be at the bottom of the pipe. If too much water goes into the container, it will flow out through this drainage hole. So next I take my drainage pipe that actually has the landscape fabric on both sides. That will prevent the soil from getting into the pipe. So it's secured by 2 zip ties, and you can see that it is now pushed inside of the storage tote. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a hole so I can push my white pipe inside of that hole. And that's how I will fill the bottom of the tube with water when this thing is filled with soil. So if you measure here, it's around 16 inches. That's good enough. For the most part, I just want to make sure that it's tall enough to extend through the soil. So there you are. You can see that if I push the pipe all the way down into the bottom of the flexible pipe, it will extend beyond past the top of the container. I'm just going to cut a hole large enough so I can push that pipe down through the drainage pipe and no soil will get through that connection. So that's all I want. I want to have that pipe, the white pipe inside the black flexible hose. And then in the center, I'm going to put a small piece of flexible hose, again, covered on both sides with landscape fabric to prevent soil from going inside. It's a little complicated, but after I do the second one, you'll see how easy it is. Now that I had time to remember how I built the first container, I'm going to build 3 more, just like it. So the first thing we want to do is we want to cut the flexible landscape pipe long enough so it wraps around in the bottom of the storage container, almost like the letter C or something close to it. And then let's test fit, and we push it in the bottom, and that is a good fit. So now that I have the hose cut to the right length, I'm going to cut landscape fabric and secure them using 2 zip ties on each end. I'm cutting 12 by 12 squares or something similar. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be able to fit on the end of the landscape tube and cover it. That's it. After the fabric is cut, I'm going to use 2 cable ties combined so I can fit around that tube. If the cable tie was long enough where I didn't have to combine them, then obviously I would only use 1. But there's 2 things that everyone should have in their car besides, let me take it back. You need to have a wrench, you need to have a Phillips screwdriver, you need to have a flathead screwdriver, you need to have duct tape, and lastly, you need to have cable ties in your survival kit, and everyone should have a survival kit in the trunk of your car. By connecting the two cable ties together, it'll be long enough to go around that pipe. So I'm going to fit the landscape fabric on the end of the pipe. Remember the 12 by 12 that we cut, and just secure it using that cable tie. Now I'm going to measure and cut a small portion to go in the center. So remember, we have the drainage pipe that goes around the perimeter of the container. Well, I want one in the middle also, so that also can fill up with water. The more voids that we put at the bottom of the container, the more water it'll hold, and the less we have to water the plant up top. After you make sure it fits into the container along with the larger drainage pipe, then you're just going to secure landscape fabric on both ends using the cable ties like we did the longer piece. And here we are, drilling drainage holes on both sides. I'm at 3 3/4, and that's a 1-inch bit. And I'm basically just drilling on both sides. So at the bottom of the container, there'll be water, and then there'll be a gap of air, and then soil, or something like that. All right, then I just need to cut the tubes, and I usually like to cut one end at a 45-degree angle, and that end is the one that goes inside the tube. So it's at a 45, almost like a point inside the tube, just to make sure that water will flow freely from through the tube. Now here comes the fun part, filling the containers with the potting mix. So based on my calculations, one bag should almost fill up that entire container, and that is a 50-quart bag. I think that bag was around $16. It is potting mix. It is not soil. If you're planting inside, you definitely want to try potting mix. You don't want to do soil because soil comes with the bugs, and you don't want the bugs inside. Whatever you do, you want to keep the bugs at a minimum. So there I am. As I put the first layer of potting mix in the bottom, I am packing it into all the little crevices, and I'm taking my time with this because it's very important to get the potting mix down to the bottom of the container, because what will happen is I will fill the bottom of the container with water, and it is the potting mix that will wick the water up through the soil. So the potting mix acts as the wick. Then it takes the moisture from the bottom of the container to the root. I said it twice. Hopefully you understand. Now I'm going to add about 1.5 cups of lime. So since I'm using potting mix and not soil, inside the potting mix is peat moss, and peat is very acidic. So you want to add some lime to raise the pH. That's the reason why you add lime. I usually like to mix the lime in like the top 2-3 inches of the soil, and when I do that, I let that soil sit for like a week to let that lime work its way through the soil. But in this case, I'm pushing the lime further down in the container, and I am mixing it around, but it's not going to come in contact with the plant because the plant's going to be about 3 inches above the lime. But yeah, lime is very essential when you use potting mix. And here comes the fertilizer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add fertilizer down the center of the container where I am not going to plant. I'm going to plant on both sides. And then I'm just going to cover the container with the rest of the potting mix, and I am almost done. I say almost because what you have now is you have a nice container with no flowers and no cover. Next, I'm going to use that same landscape fabric, and I'm going to cut a cover that covers the top of the container, and I'm going to cut it long enough so I could actually tie it down on every side. So I'm actually cutting it 14 inches wider and 14 inches longer than I need because I want 7 inches of overhang on every side. I'll let that sink in. Then I just measure it to the container and kind of center it before I cut a hole for the drain pipe. It's not a drain pipe, it's a fill tube. Before I cut a hole for the fill tube. Then I get some twine or rope and secure that landscape fabric to the top of the storage container. Sometimes the easiest thing can be the biggest challenge. I mean, I'm just tying a doggone knot. But I want to make it look nice. I want it to be tight. I want to pull the landscape fabric, so you want to take your time and do it right. And finally, the fun part begins. I cut an X into the top of the landscape fabric. Then I push the fabric out the way. And then I use my hand with my glove and I make a little hole, and then I push the cup in the hole. Wait a minute, I didn't push the cup in the hole? Oh, you're so lazy. So pro tip, you push the cup in the hole first, and then it's much easier to put the plant in the hole. I don't know what I was thinking. Either way, yes, it works out fine. So that's what I did. And I did that for all 4 plants in this container. That actually happens to be sweet basil. So this is going to be my herb container. Again, X. I move the landscape fabric back out of my way. Then I use my hand with the Smurf glove. And again, I did not use the container to make an impression, but I guess I thought I was a pro that night. It was probably late. So that's right. Oh, by the way, when you rush, you make mistakes. I don't know if you never heard that before, but I say it all the time. All right. And we'll get to the end of this container, and that'll be a finished product. That's it. The only thing left to do after you plant these plants is to give it a little drink of water on the top. And then I take off the top off my filler tube and I fill the container until water starts to drain out of the drain holes on one or both of the sides. That's how I know my container is full. And believe it or not, that container is usually good for a week. Now, since it is a container, it heats up a lot faster than if it's being planted in the earth. But nevertheless, I just every now and then, maybe every few days, until I get a better feeling of how that that plant or those plants like to drink. So you've seen my other videos like tomato being a weed. Man, that tomato plant is really thirsty. So if I put 2 tomato plants in the top of that container, that plant will drink all day, all night. That plant is a fish. Does that make any sense? But yes, you must make sure that you keep fluid in the bottom of the container, especially tomatoes, and it'll thrive. So I love my containers. I think I built a total of, I don't know, I can't even tell you how many I built. Maybe 8 for this year to go with the rest of the collection, and I enjoy doing it every year. This is not the last you've seen of these containers, but I do appreciate you watching. There's a lot more to come.